Rebecca Thompson clutched her shawl against the bitter Wyoming wind as she stood outside the massive oak doors of the Morrison Ranch house. Snow swirled around her worn boots, each flake a reminder that winter was coming fast and merciless to Copper Creek. Her 6-year-old son Tommy shivered beside her, his thin jacket no match for the mountain cold. The words she was about to speak felt impossible, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She raised her trembling hand to knock, knowing that behind these doors lived Jake Morrison, the giant of a man who owned half the territory. Everyone called him a giant, not just for his towering height that reached nearly 7 feet, but for his enormous presence that commanded respect from every soul in 3 counties. Rebecca had rehearsed her proposition 100 times during the long walk from town, but now, facing the moment of truth, her courage wavered like a candle in the storm. The door swung open before she could knock, and there he stood. Jake Morrison filled the entire doorframe, his broad shoulders blocking out the warm light from within. His dark hair was peppered with early silver despite his 35 years, and his green eyes held the kind of steady strength that came from building an empire with his bare hands. He looked down at the bedraggled woman and child on his porch, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Thompson," his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "What brings you out in this weather?" Rebecca's throat went dry. The words she'd practiced seemed to stick like molasses. Tommy pressed closer to her side, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the man before them. Jake Morrison wasn't just tall. He was built like the mountains themselves, solid and unmovable, with hands that could gentle a wild horse or lift a full-grown steer. "Morrison," Rebecca finally managed, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I need to ask you something. Something that might sound crazy, but I'm out of options." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in curiosity. He stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Come in before you both freeze to death. We can talk by the fire." The warmth of the ranch house enveloped them like an embrace. Rebecca had never been inside the Morrison home, and the sight took her breath away. Rich wooden beams stretched across high ceilings, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing merrily within. Everything spoke of prosperity and permanence, a stark contrast to her own crumbling cabin, where wind whistled through loose boards and the roof leaked when it rained. Jake led them to the sitting area near the fire, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. He gestured to a comfortable chair covered in soft leather, then settled himself across from them in a chair that creaked under his weight. Tommy stared up at him with wide eyes, clearly fascinated by meeting someone even bigger than the giants in his storybooks. "Now then," Jake said, his voice gentler than Rebecca expected. "What's this about?" Rebecca took a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched in every line. She was only 26, but hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung limp beneath her faded bonnet, and her blue dress, though clean, had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt. "Work for me," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she lost her nerve. "Let me work for you, and I'll make you my wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackling. Jake's green eyes widened in shock, and Tommy looked up at his mother with confusion. The proposition hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to take back. Jake leaned forward slowly, his massive hands clasped before him. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you might have that backwards." Rebecca's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she pressed on. "No, I meant what I said. I know it sounds desperate because it is. My husband died 8 months ago, and I've been trying to make it on our homestead. But the crops failed, and the bank is foreclosing next week. Tommy and I have nowhere to go, no family to turn to. I've asked every ranch in the county for work, but nobody wants to hire a woman with a child." She paused, gathering her courage. "But you're different, Mr. Morrison. People say you're fair, that you judge folks by their character, not their circumstances. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and clean and help with anything you need. And in return," she swallowed hard, "in return, I'll be the wife you've never had time to find." Jake sat back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating green eyes. The firelight cast shadows across his rugged features, making him look even more imposing. Rebecca could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing her desperate offer against his own needs and desires. Jake Morrison had built his empire through careful calculation and measured risks. But Rebecca Thompson's proposition was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Here was a woman offering herself not out of love or attraction, but out of pure survival instinct, willing to trade her freedom for her child's security. The honesty of her desperation was both heartbreaking and oddly compelling. Tommy tugged at his mother's skirt, whispering loudly, "Mama, is the giant man going to help us?" His innocent question seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Jake's stern expression softened as he looked at the child, seeing the hunger in his thin face and the patches on his small clothes. "Your boy needs feeding," Jake observed quietly. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Rebecca's chin lifted with pride even as her stomach growled in response. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Manage fine, Mr. Morrison. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a fair trade." "A fair trade," Jake repeated slowly, as if testing the words. He stood and walked to the window, his imposing silhouette framed against the swirling snow. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson, what makes you think I need a wife?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. She'd assumed that a successful man like Jake Morrison would naturally want a family, a woman to manage his household and bear his children. But looking at him now, standing alone against the window like a mountain weathering the storm, she realized she knew nothing about his personal desires or fears. "I suppose I assumed," she admitted. "A man of your standing, with all this land and success, surely you'd want someone to share it with, to carry on your name." Jake turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "And you think you could be that someone? A woman who marries me out of desperation, rather than affection?" The blunt question stung, but Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I think affection can grow between people who respect each other and work toward common goals. My marriage to Tommy's father started as an arrangement between our families, but we found contentment together. Not grand passion perhaps, but something real and lasting." Jake studied her for a long moment, then surprised her by kneeling down to Tommy's level. The child took an instinctive step backward, overwhelmed by the man's size even when crouched down. "What do you think, young man?" Jake asked gently. "Should I hire your mother?" Tommy looked between Jake and Rebecca, his 6-year-old mind processing the adult conversation as best he could. "Mama works real hard," he said solemnly. "She fixes everything that breaks and makes the best cornbread in Wyoming." A smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth. High praise indeed. "And what about you? What would you do if your mother worked for me?" "I could help too," Tommy said eagerly. "I'm good with animals. Mama says I have gentle hands." Jake nodded seriously, treating the child's offer with the same consideration he'd give an adult. "That's important work. Animals know when someone cares about them." He stood and returned to his chair, his decision clearly forming. Rebecca held her breath, her entire future hanging on this giant man's next words. "I'll offer you this," Jake said finally. "Come work for me for 1 month. You'll have a room in the main house, meals for both you and the boy, and fair wages. At the end of the month, if we suit each other, we can discuss more permanent arrangements." Rebecca's heart leaped, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And the marriage arrangement? If we find ourselves compatible after a month of honest work and daily contact, then yes, I'd consider marriage. But it would be a real marriage, Mrs. Thompson. Not just a business transaction. I won't have a woman in my bed who's only there out of obligation." The frankness of his statement made Rebecca blush, but she appreciated his honesty. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. I wouldn't expect anything less from a man of your reputation." Jake stood and extended his massive hand toward her. "Then we have an agreement. You start tomorrow morning. Pete Wilson, my foreman, will show you around and explain your duties." Rebecca took his hand, her small fingers nearly disappearing in his grip. His skin was calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," she whispered, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "You won't regret this." "We'll see," Jake replied, but his tone was kind. "Pete will help you move your belongings from the homestead. No sense leaving anything valuable for the bank to claim. As they prepared to leave, Tommy tugged on Jake's coat. The giant man looked down at the child with patient curiosity. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said seriously, "if you marry my mama, does that make you my new papa?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Jake knelt down again, bringing himself closer to the child's level. "That would depend on whether you'd want me as your papa, son. Being a father is a big responsibility, not something a man should take lightly." Tommy considered this with the gravity only children could bring to serious matters. "My real papa is in heaven with the angels now. Mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. Maybe having a new papa would make her smile more." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "Well then, we'll have to see if I'm worthy of the job, won't we?" As Rebecca and Tommy made their way back through the snow toward town, Jake stood at his window watching their small figures disappear into the white. He'd built his ranch through careful planning and calculated risks, but this decision felt different. Rebecca Thompson had offered him something he hadn't realized he wanted, a chance to be more than just a successful rancher, to be a husband and father, to build something that would outlast the cattle on the land. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the valley like a clean slate. Rebecca arrived at the ranch house before sunrise, carrying a battered suitcase that held everything she and Tommy owned. Pete Wilson, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a permanent squint from years of sun and wind, met them at the kitchen door. "Mrs. Thompson," Pete said, tipping his hat. "The boss told me to expect you. Come on in, let's get you settled." The kitchen was warm and spacious, with a massive wood-burning stove and copper pots hanging from hooks along the walls. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, scarred from years of use but polished to a warm shine. It was the kind of kitchen that spoke of family meals and holiday gatherings, though Rebecca suspected it had seen little of either in recent years. "This here's your domain now," Pete explained, gesturing around the room. "Boss has been making do with my cooking, which is to say he's been half-starved for decent food. Man can't live on beans and hardtack forever." Rebecca set down her suitcase and looked around with growing confidence. This was work she understood, a challenge she could meet. "What time does Mr. Morrison usually eat?" "Sunrise, noon and sunset, regular as clockwork. He's out checking the north pasture this morning. Won't be back till lunch. Gives you time to get acquainted with everything." Pete showed her to a comfortable room on the second floor, with windows overlooking the valley and a smaller adjoining room perfect for Tommy. The furniture was simple but well made, and clean quilts covered the beds. It was more luxury than Rebecca had known in months. "Boss had these rooms prepared special," Pete said, noting her surprise. "Said a lady and her boy deserved proper accommodations." As Pete left her to settle in, Rebecca stood at the window watching the sun rise over the mountains. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. Jake Morrison had kept his word about treating her with dignity, and the month ahead suddenly seemed full of possibility, rather than mere survival. Tommy explored their new quarters with the enthusiasm only children could muster, delighted by the soft beds and the view of horses in the distant corrals. "Mama," he called from his window, "there's a dog down there. A big brown one." Rebecca joined him at the window and saw a massive dog patrolling the ranch yard, its thick coat gleaming in the morning sun. "That's probably the ranch dog, sweetheart." He said the debt transferred to me. Jake's green eyes remained fixed on her face, reading every expression, every flicker of emotion. "How much money?" $3,000. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly on the amount. It might ask, "Will have been $3 million for all the hope she had of paying it. Carl claims Thomas borrowed it to buy our homestead, but I never saw any paperwork, never heard Thomas mention any business dealings with his brother. And you believe your husband never made such an arrangement?" Rebecca met Jake's gaze directly. "Thomas was many things, Mr. Morrison, but he wasn't a liar. If he'd owed his brother money, he would have told me. He would have made arrangements for repayment before he died." Jake leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his substantial weight. "Tell me about Carl Brennan. What kind of man is he?" The question made Rebecca's skin crawl with unpleasant memories. The kind who takes what he wants and justifies it later. He's charming when it suits him, cruel when charm fails. Thomas always said Carl had been trouble since they were boys, but family was family. Is he married? Does he have legitimate business interests? He claims to be a traveling merchant, but his money comes from gambling and worse things. Thomas tried to help him once, got him a job at the lumber mill, but Carl was caught stealing within a week. Rebecca wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. After Thomas died, Carl started coming around our homestead, offering to take care of Tommy and me. When I refused his help, that's when he produced this supposed debt. Jake stood and walked to the window, his imposing silhouette framed against the glass. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick flakes, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. You think he manufactured the debt as an excuse to force you into dependence on him? I'm certain of it. Carl always resented that Thomas had a wife and land and respectability, things Carl could never earn through honest work. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she spoke the truth aloud. He sees Tommy as the son he'll never have and me as the wife he thinks he deserves. Has he threatened you directly? Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. He said if I couldn't pay the debt, there were other ways to settle accounts. He suggested I could work for him, cooking and cleaning, and that Tommy could be apprenticed to. Learn his trade. When I refused, he said he'd take the matter to the territorial court. Jake turned back toward her, his face grim. Carl Brennan has no legal standing for such a claim without proper documentation. But that doesn't mean he won't try other methods of persuasion. That's what I'm afraid of. Carl doesn't accept defeat gracefully. If he can't have what he wants through legal means, he'll find other ways. Rebecca stood and moved closer to the fire, seeking warmth against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I should never have brought this trouble to your door, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps it would be better if Tommy and I left before Carl discovers where we've gone. Absolutely not. Jake's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions and seeing them through. You made an agreement with me, Mrs. Thompson, and I intend to honor it regardless of outside interference. Besides, running would only delay the inevitable. Men like Carl Brennan don't give up easily. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by this giant man's willingness to stand between her family and danger. You don't understand what you're risking. Carl has friends, men who aren't particular about how they earn their money. He could bring real trouble to your ranch. Jake's laugh was low and confident. Mrs. Thompson, I didn't build this operation by backing down from trouble. If Carl Brennan wants to test himself against the Morrison Ranch, he's welcome to try. The quiet certainty in his voice both comforted and alarmed Rebecca. She was beginning to understand that Jake Morrison was not a man who made idle threats or empty promises. If he said he would protect her and Tommy, he meant it completely, regardless of the personal cost. The next morning brought crisp sunshine and the sounds of ranch life awakening. Rebecca rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the crew, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of cooking for hardworking men. She made hearty pancakes with bacon and strong coffee, the kind of meal that would sustain a man through long hours in the cold. Jake appeared in the kitchen as she was setting out the last of the food, his hair still damp from washing and his shirt crisp despite the early hour. Smells like heaven in here, he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. Thank you. I hope the men will find it satisfactory. Rebecca poured coffee into his cup, the dark liquid steaming in the cool morning air. Where's the boy this morning? Still sleeping. The excitement of yesterday tired him out completely. Rebecca smiled at the memory of Tommy's joy over meeting Ranger and exploring the barn. He's not used to so much adventure. Jake nodded, then surprised her by filling a second plate with food. Take this up to him when he wakes. Growing boys need proper fuel. The small kindness touched Rebecca more than grand gestures might have. Jake Morrison was proving to be a man who noticed details, who cared about the welfare of those under his protection. As she watched him eat with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to starting work before sunrise, she found herself wondering about the loneliness of his life. Pete Wilson arrived with 2 other ranch hands, just as Jake was finishing his breakfast. Rebecca served them at the long table, listening to their easy conversation about the day's work. They treated her with respectful courtesy, clearly having been instructed by Jake to consider her a valued member of the household rather than hired help. Weather's holding clear, Pete observed, looking out the window at the blue sky. "Good day to check the fence lines in the upper pastures. Take young Danny with you," Jake replied, referring to one of the newer hands. "That section needs extra attention before the snow gets too deep." As the men prepared to leave, Jake turned to Rebecca. "I'll be working close to the house today, breaking horses in the main corral. Keep Tommy near the buildings, and if you see any strangers approaching, ring the bell by the kitchen door." Rebecca nodded, understanding that Jake was positioning himself as a guardian without making her feel like a prisoner. The arrangement spoke of his tactical thinking, his ability to plan for trouble while maintaining normal ranch operations. Tommy woke shortly after the men departed, full of energy and eager to explore more of his new surroundings. Rebecca dressed him warmly and allowed him to play in the ranch yard under her watchful eye while she tackled the household chores that had been neglected during Jake's bachelor existence. The house was clean but impersonal, lacking the touches that made a place feel like a home. Rebecca found herself organizing closets, mending torn curtains, and polishing furniture with the kind of attention that transformed mere shelter into sanctuary. Each improvement felt like a small investment in their future, a way of proving her value beyond simple cooking and cleaning. Around mid-morning, the sound of horses and shouting drew her to the kitchen window. In the main corral, Jake was working, with a magnificent black stallion that seemed determined to throw off anything resembling human control. The horse reared and bucked with wild fury, but Jake remained calm and patient, never forcing a confrontation but never backing down either. Tommy pressed his face against the glass beside her, mesmerized by the display. "Mama, look how big that horse is. And look how the giant man isn't scared." Rebecca watched Jake work with growing admiration. Despite his size and strength, he relied on quiet persistence rather than brute force. When the stallion finally accepted the saddle without protest, Jake rewarded the animal with gentle words and careful strokes along its neck. The display revealed something important about Jake Morrison's character, his belief that cooperation was more valuable than domination. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Rebecca was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Ranger's sharp bark alerted her to approaching riders. 3 men on horseback were making their way up the road toward the ranch house, and even from a distance, Rebecca recognized the leader's slouching posture and cocky bearing. Carl Brennan had found her. Rebecca gathered Tommy quickly and hurried him inside, her heart pounding with familiar fear. Through the kitchen window, she watched Carl dismount with theatrical flair, clearly intending to make an impression. He was a handsome man in a rough way, with dark hair and an easy smile that had charmed many people before they learned what lay beneath it. Jake emerged from the barn, alerted by Ranger's continued barking. Even at a distance, Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders as he approached the uninvited guests. Carl's 2 companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons in a display that was meant to intimidate. "Morrison," Carl called out in a voice that carried clearly across the yard. "Heard you might have something that belongs to me." Jake stopped about 10 feet away from the visitors, close enough for conversation, but far enough to react if violence erupted. "Can't say that I do, Brennan. Everything on this ranch belongs here." Carl's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Now, that's where you're wrong, friend. My brother's widow and her boy, their family obligations. Blood runs thicker than employment contracts. Mrs. Thompson and her son are guests in my home." Jake replied evenly. "They're free to leave whenever they choose, but that choice belongs to them alone." "Choice." Carl laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That's a fine word, Morrison, but some choices are made by circumstances beyond our control. Rebecca owes me money, a considerable sum that her late husband borrowed. I'm here to collect what's mine." Jake's voice remained calm, but Rebecca could see the steel beneath his polite words. "If you have legal documentation of such a debt, you're welcome to present it to the territorial court. Until then, Mrs. Thompson remains under my protection." Carl's smile faded slightly, his handsome features hardening with frustrated anger. "Protection, is it? That's an interesting word choice. Makes a man wonder what kind of protection you're offering a young widow." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Rebecca held her breath, knowing that Carl was deliberately provoking Jake, trying to goad him into a fight that would give Carl justification for whatever violence he'd planned. Jake took a step forward, his imposing height casting a shadow over Carl's smaller frame. "I'd be very careful about the implications you're making, Brennan. My hospitality has limits." Carl raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "No offense intended, Morrison. Just concerned about family welfare. Blood is blood, after all. Then you'll understand why I'm concerned about the welfare of the family currently residing in my home." Jake's meaning was crystal clear. Rebecca and Tommy were under his protection, and Carl would have to go through him to reach them. The standoff stretched for long moments, the two men sizing each other up like predators determining territory. Carl's companions shifted restlessly in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with their boss's decision to challenge Jake Morrison on his own land. Finally, Carl stepped back and mounted his horse with fluid grace. "This isn't over, Morrison. Family obligations don't disappear just because a widow finds herself a new protector. I'll be back when you've had time to reconsider your position." "You're welcome to return any time," Jake replied, "preferably with proper legal documentation and a better attitude." Carl's parting laugh was harsh and humorless. "Legal documentation. That's rich, coming from a man whose own claim to this land came from a poker game in Denver." The barb struck home. Rebecca could see it in the slight tightening around Jake's eyes. But he remained silent as Carl and his men rode away, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground like a promise of future trouble. After the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, Jake stood in the yard for several minutes, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Rebecca could see him thinking, planning, calculating the risks that Carl Brennan's presence brought to his peaceful ranch. When Jake finally came inside, his expression was grim but determined. Tommy ran to him immediately, having watched the confrontation from the window with wide, frightened eyes. "Was that man going to hurt us?" Tommy asked, his small voice trembling with worry. Jake knelt down to the child's level, his large hands gentle on Tommy's shoulders. "No one's going to hurt you or your mama, son. That's a promise." "But he looked mean. Meaner than the wolves in my storybook." "Some men are mean, Tommy, but that's why good men have to be strong. To protect the people who need protecting." Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. "You don't need to be afraid as long as you're here." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting Jake's promise with the simple faith that children brought to the world. Rebecca felt her heart contract with emotion, watching this giant man comfort her son with such patience and care. After Tommy returned to his toys, Jake turned to Rebecca with a more serious expression. "Carl's not going to give up easily. He's testing boundaries, seeing how far he can push before meeting real resistance. I saw that. He was trying to make you angry, trying to provoke a fight." Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, still shaken by the encounter. "What did he mean about your land coming from a poker game?" Jake's jaw tightened slightly. "Ancient history. The previous owner lost this ranch in a card game, fair and square. I bought the deed from the winner and have operated legally ever since. Carl's fishing for ammunition, looking for any weakness he can exploit. Will that cause problems for you? If he spreads rumors about the legitimacy of your ownership? Let him try. I have clear title and 10 years of legitimate operation to back my claim. Carl Brennan's word against mine won't carry much weight in any honest court." Jake moved to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of returning riders. "But that doesn't mean he won't try other methods of persuasion." Rebecca joined him at the window, studying his profile as he watched for danger. "You could still change your mind, Mr. Morrison. Send us away before this escalates into something that could damage your reputation or your business." Jake turned to look at her, his green eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "Mrs. Thompson, I gave you my word, and I meant it. Carl Brennan could bring the entire territorial army, and it wouldn't change my position. You and Tommy stay as long as you want to stay." The quiet conviction in his voice sent warmth spreading through Rebecca's chest. Jake Morrison was proving to be exactly the kind of man she'd hoped he was, someone whose word meant something, whose protection could be trusted completely. That evening, as they shared dinner at the long table, the atmosphere felt different. The easy companionship of their first days together had been replaced by something deeper, a sense of shared purpose and mutual dependence. Carl Brennan's visit had forced them to acknowledge that their arrangement was more than business. that personal feelings and protective instincts were becoming part of the equation. Tommy chattered about his day, seemingly unaffected by the morning's tension. He'd spent hours with Ranger, learning to brush the big dog's thick coat and feed him treats from the kitchen. The child's resilience amazed Rebecca, his ability to find joy even in circumstances that would terrify many adults. Ranger knows lots of tricks, Tommy informed Jake proudly. He can shake hands and roll over and even play dead when you point your finger at him like a gun. Ranger's a smart dog, Jake agreed. He's also a good judge of character. The fact that he likes you says something important about the kind of person you're growing up to be. Tommy beamed at the praise, clearly basking in Jake's approval. Rebecca watched the interaction with growing wonder. In just 2 days, Jake had become a positive influence in her son's life, providing the kind of masculine guidance that Tommy had been missing since his father's death. After Tommy was tucked into bed, Rebecca and Jake sat by the fire again, but this time the conversation felt different. The threat of Carl Brennan had stripped away some of the polite formality between them, replacing it with the kind of honest communication that came from shared danger. "Thank you," Rebecca said quietly, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "For standing up to Carl, for protecting Tommy, for keeping your word when it would be easier to break it. No thanks necessary. Any decent man would do the same." Jake's voice was gruff with emotion he was trying to hide. "That's not true, and we both know it. Most men would have sent us away the moment Carl showed up. You're risking your reputation, your business, possibly your safety for people you barely know." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said finally. "Maybe having people to protect gives a man's life more meaning than just accumulating land and cattle." The honest admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. "Is that what this is about?" she asked softly. "Loneliness." "Partly." Jake met her eyes across the space between their chairs. "But it's more than that now. Watching you with Tommy, seeing how you've already started making this house feel like a home, standing up to Carl's intimidation today. You're not just filling an empty space, Rebecca. You're making everything better." The use of her first name sent a shiver through Rebecca that had nothing to do with cold. In Jake's deep voice, her name sounded like a caress, like something precious and worth protecting. "What happens when the month is over?" she asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her thoughts. "That depends on what you want to happen." Jake leaned forward slightly, his intensity focused entirely on her. "The marriage offer stands, if you're willing. Not because of desperation or obligation, but because I think we could build something real together." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. "Even with Carl Brennan threatening trouble? Even knowing that being associated with me could bring danger to your ranch? Especially because of those things. I won't be driven off my own land or frightened away from people I care about by a man like Carl Brennan." Jake's voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "The question is whether you're willing to tie your future to mine, knowing that Carl won't give up easily." Rebecca looked around the warm kitchen, thinking of Tommy sleeping peacefully upstairs under quilts that smelled of sunshine and safety. She thought of the way Jake had knelt to comfort her frightened son, the patience he'd shown with the wild stallion, the absolute conviction in his voice when he'd promised protection. "I think," she said carefully, "that a woman could do much worse than tie her future to a man who keeps his promises and stands up for what's right." Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his stern features into something beautiful and hopeful. "Then we understand each other, Mrs. Thompson." "Rebecca," she corrected softly. "If we're going to be partners, you should probably use my name." "Rebecca." Jake tested the name, his voice wrapping around it like a caress. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling across the ranch yard. But inside the Morrison house, warmth and possibility filled the spaces between words, and two people who had started as strangers began to discover what it meant to choose each other not from desperation, but from hope. The morning after Carl's visit dawned gray and ominous, with heavy clouds pressing down on the valley like a wool blanket. Rebecca woke to the sound of men's voices in the yard below, low and urgent in a way that made her stomach clench with worry. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, leaving Tommy still sleeping in his warm bed. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake standing with Pete Wilson and 3 other ranch hands near the main corral. Their postures were tense, and Pete was gesturing towards something Rebecca couldn't see from her vantage point. When Jake turned toward the house, his expression was thunderous. Rebecca met him at the kitchen door, already knowing the news would be bad. What's happened? Someone cut the fence in the north pasture during the night, Jake said grimly, hanging his hat on the peg with more force than necessary. Drove off about 30 head of cattle into the canyon country. Professional work, not the kind of mischief kids might get up to. The implication was clear. Carl Brennan was escalating his campaign of intimidation, moving from verbal threats to economic warfare. Rebecca felt guilt wash over her like cold water. This is because of me. Carl's trying to force your hand by making it expensive to keep us here. Jake's green eyes flashed with anger, but Rebecca sensed it wasn't directed at her. Carl Brennan is responsible for Carl Brennan's actions. Don't take blame for another man's crimes. But if Tommy and I weren't here, your cattle would still be safely in your pastures. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of bringing trouble to this peaceful ranch. Jake stepped closer, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than intimidating. Rebecca, listen to me carefully. 30 head of cattle is a loss, but it's not devastating. I've weathered worse storms than Carl Brennan, and I'll weather this one too. The question is whether you trust me enough to see it through. Before Rebecca could answer, Tommy's voice called from upstairs. Mama, is something wrong? There are lots of men in the yard. I'll get him, Jake said, surprising Rebecca. No sense in him worrying about adult troubles. She watched Jake climb the stairs, his heavy boots making the wooden steps creak under his weight. There was something deeply moving about seeing this giant of a man making an effort to comfort her frightened child. Most men would have left such duties to her, but Jake seemed to understand that Tommy needed reassurance from the strongest person in his new world. When they came back down together, Tommy was dressed but still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Jake had clearly told him something to ease his mind, because the child looked curious rather than afraid. Mama, Jake says some bad men tried to steal his cows, but the dogs and horses are all safe, Tommy reported earnestly. And Ranger helped chase the bad men away. Rebecca looked questioningly at Jake, who shrugged slightly. Close enough to the truth for a 6-year-old. No need to frighten him with details. As Rebecca prepared breakfast for the men, she could hear them discussing their plans through the open door. Pete Wilson's voice carried clearly as he outlined the tracking strategy. Trails clear enough heading into Devil's Canyon. If we ride hard, we might catch up before they reach the Badlands. Take 4 men and follow the trail, Jake instructed. But don't engage if you find them. I want to know where they're holding my cattle, not start a shooting war. What about you, boss? You coming with us? There was a pause before Jake answered. I'm staying close to the ranch today. Someone needs to keep an eye on things here. Rebecca understood what he wasn't saying. Jake suspected that driving off the cattle might be a diversion, a way to draw him and his men away from the ranch house, while Carl made another move. The thought made her hands shake as she poured coffee into tin cups. After the tracking party rode out, an unusual quiet settled over the Morrison Ranch. Only Jake, Rebecca, Tommy, and one young ranch hand named Billy remained to maintain the normal operations. Billy was barely 18, eager and hardworking, but hardly the kind of backup Jake would need if serious trouble arrived. Why don't you show Tommy how to properly curry a horse? Jake suggested to Billy. Boy needs to learn if he's going to be useful around here. Tommy's face lit up with excitement at the prospect of learning real ranch skills. Rebecca started to object, worried about her son being around the large animals, but Jake's steady gaze reassured her. Billy's good with horses and better with children, Jake said quietly. Tommy will be safe, and it'll keep him occupied if we have unexpected visitors. As if summoned by his words, Ranger's sharp bark announced approaching riders. Rebecca's heart sank as she counted 5 men this time, Carl Brennan leading them with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Take Tommy into the barn with Billy, Jake instructed calmly. Stay there until I come for you. Rebecca wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him and face whatever Carl had planned, but she recognized the wisdom in Jake's request. Tommy's safety had to come first, and her presence might only escalate whatever confrontation was brewing. From the barn's hayloft, Rebecca and Tommy peered through the wide doors as Carl dismounted with theatrical flair. His four companions remained mounted this time, but their hands rested openly on their weapons. These weren't the same men who had accompanied Carl yesterday. They looked harder, more professional, the kind of men who solved problems with violence rather than conversation. "Morrison," Carl called out cheerfully, as if he were visiting an old friend. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for riding." Jake emerged from the house, moving with the deceptively casual gait of a man ready for trouble. "Brennan, you're becoming quite the regular visitor. Hope you brought better manners this time." Carl laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the yard. "Always the gentleman, aren't you, Morrison? I admire that in a man, truly I do. But gentlemanly behavior only works when everyone plays by the same rules." "And what rules would those be?" "The rules of family obligation, of course. Blood loyalty, debts of honor, that sort of thing." Carl gestured expansively, including his armed companions in the conversation. "My friends here, they're very interested in these concepts. They believe strongly that family debts should be honored." Jake's voice remained level, but Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders. "If you have legitimate claims, present them to the territorial court. Otherwise, you're trespassing on private property." "Trespassing?" Carl's mock surprise was expertly performed. "That's a harsh word, Morrison, especially considering some folks might question your own right to this particular piece of property." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Carl was suggesting he might challenge Jake's ownership of the ranch itself, using whatever information he'd gathered about the poker game origins of Jake's claim. "My title is clear and legally recorded," Jake replied evenly. "Can you say the same about this supposed debt you're chasing?" Carl's smile sharpened, revealing the predator beneath the charming facade. "Documents can be produced when necessary. Morrison, the question is whether you want this settled quietly between gentlemen or whether you prefer a more public resolution. What exactly are you proposing?" "Simple business arrangement. You turn over my sister-in-law and her boy, along with fair compensation for my trouble in tracking them down, and we'll call everything even. Clean slate, no hard feelings." Jake's laugh was harsh and humorless. "And if I refuse? Then we explore other options. You might be surprised how many people are interested in your operation here, Morrison. Successful ranches attract attention, not all of it friendly." Carl's meaning was crystal clear. If Jake didn't cooperate voluntarily, Carl would bring enough trouble to force his hand. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of Carl's plan. He wasn't just threatening her and Tommy. He was prepared to destroy Jake's entire life to get what he wanted. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, knowing that her desperate plea for help had brought this danger to an innocent man. "Let me make something clear, Brennan," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Mrs. Thompson and her son are under my protection. That protection doesn't have conditions or expiration dates. If you want to challenge that, you're welcome to try, but understand the consequences." Carl's eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. "Consequences, Morrison? That's an interesting word choice. Makes a man wonder what you're prepared to do to protect your investment. Whatever it takes." The simple statement hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rebecca could see Carl evaluating Jake's resolve, measuring the giant man's capabilities against his own resources. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Carl's handsome features. Then one of his companions leaned down to whisper something in Carl's ear, and his confidence returned. "Well then, Morrison, I suppose we'll see how far you're willing to go. Family obligations have a way of asserting themselves, regardless of outside interference." Carl remounted his horse with fluid grace, but before riding away, he called out one final threat. "You might want to check on your cattle, Morrison. I hear there's been some predator trouble in the area. Wolves, maybe, or something worse." The implication was clear. Carl was admitting responsibility for the stolen cattle while threatening further losses if Jake didn't cooperate. As the 5 riders disappeared over the ridge, Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the overcast sky. Jake stood in the yard for several minutes after Carl's departure, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray horizon. When he finally turned toward the barn, his expression was grim but determined. "You can come out now," he called. "There. Gone." Rebecca climbed down from the hayloft with Tommy close behind her, her mind racing with fear and guilt. Billy emerged from Ranger's stall, where he'd been hiding with the dog. The young man's face was pale with worry. "Boss, those weren't local men," Billy said urgently. "I recognized one of them from Cheyenne. Gunfighter named Tex Martinez. If Carl Brennan's hiring that kind of help, this is serious trouble." Jake nodded grimly. "How serious?" "Martinez doesn't work cheap, and he doesn't take jobs unless he's confident he can deliver. Word is he's killed at least 6 men in fair fights, and probably more in fights that weren't so fair." Rebecca felt her knees go weak. Carl had brought professional killers to their dispute, men who would murder Jake without hesitation if the price was right. The realization that her desperate bargain might cost this good man his life was almost more than she could bear. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you have to let us go. This has gone too far. I won't have your blood on my hands." Jake turned to look at her, his green eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "Rebecca, I thought we settled this yesterday. You're not leaving, and I'm not backing down. Carl Brennan chose this fight, not us. But he's brought killers, men who murder for money. You could die because you try to help us." Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face now, all her carefully maintained composure crumbling under the weight of her fear for Jake's safety. Tommy moved to his mother's side, confused by her distress but sensing the adult terror that filled the barn. "Mama, why are you crying? Is Jake in trouble because of us?" The innocent question broke Rebecca's heart. Her 6-year-old son was already beginning to understand that their presence brought danger to the man who had shown them nothing but kindness. Jake knelt down to Tommy's level, his large hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "Tommy, do you remember what I told you about good men being strong to protect people who need protecting?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "You said that's why good men have to be brave." "That's right. And sometimes being brave means standing up to bad men, even when it's dangerous." Jake's voice was patient and calm, despite the deadly threat they were facing. "Your mama is worried about me, which shows she has a good heart. But I need you to help me convince her that some things are worth fighting for." "Like family?" Tommy asked, with the uncanny wisdom that children sometimes displayed. Jake's smile was gentle and sad. "Exactly like family, son." Rebecca felt her heart break at the exchange. In just a few days, Jake had become more of a father to Tommy than the boy had ever known. The bonds forming between them were genuine and precious, which made the threat to their fragile new family even more heartbreaking. "Jake," she said quietly, using his name with deliberate intimacy, "please don't do this for us. We're not worth dying for." Jake stood and moved closer to her, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than intimidating. "That's where you're wrong, Rebecca. You and Tommy are worth everything to me. More than the ranch, more than the cattle, more than my own safety." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous waters. Rebecca could see the truth in Jake's eyes, the depth of feeling that had grown so quickly between them. He wasn't just protecting her from duty or honor. He was protecting her because he loved her. "How can you say that?" she whispered. "You barely know us." "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to offer yourself in marriage to save your son. I know you work harder than any woman should have to. I know you make me want to be better than I am." Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "And I know that losing you now would destroy something in me that I didn't even realize existed." Rebecca felt her resolve wavering under the intensity of his declaration. The practical part of her mind insisted that she should take Tommy and run, disappearing into the wilderness before Jake paid the ultimate price for his kindness. But her heart was already bound to this giant man who had shown her what real protection felt like. "What do we do?" she asked finally, accepting that their fates were now intertwined regardless of the danger. "We prepare for war," Jake said. Simply, "Carl Brennan wants to play by outlaw rules, then we'll accommodate him. But we do it smart, not reckless." That afternoon, Jake sent Billy to town with carefully worded messages to Sheriff Phillips and several neighboring ranchers. The lawman needed to be informed about Carl's threats and the presence of known gunfighters in the territory. The neighboring ranchers needed to know that trouble was brewing, both as a warning and a potential call for mutual aid. While Billy was gone, Jake and Rebecca worked together to prepare the ranch house for siege. They moved all the ammunition to the main house, secured shutters over the windows, and established clear lines of sight from defensive positions. Jake's military experience during the Indian campaigns showed in his methodical approach to fortification. How long can we hold out if they try to starve us out? Rebecca asked as they finished securing the last window. Depends on how patient they are, Jake replied honestly. We have enough food and ammunition for several weeks, but Carl doesn't. Strike me as the patient type. He'll try something direct first. Tommy helped where he could, treating the preparations like an elaborate game rather than life or death preparation. His innocent enthusiasm was a bright spot in the gathering. Darkness, reminding both adults what they were really fighting to protect. As evening approached, Pete Wilson returned with grim news about the stolen cattle. Found them in Devil's Canyon. All right, but they're being held by at least 8 men. Professional setup, with guards and everything. These aren't just rustlers. Looking for quick money. Any chance of getting them back without bloodshed? Jake asked. Pete shook his head. Not unless we brought a small army. They're dug in good, and they're expecting trouble. This whole thing feels like bait for a trap. Jake nodded, having reached the same conclusion. Carl wants to draw us out. Get us away from the ranch where he can control the engagement. We stay here and let him make the first move. As night fell over the Morrison Ranch, Rebecca found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the darkness beyond the yard. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were planning violence against the people she was learning to love. The thought that her desperate bargain might result in bloodshed and death was almost unbearable. Jake appeared beside her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. Second thoughts? He asked gently. Every minute, Rebecca admitted. But not about staying. About whether I deserve the protection you're offering. We don't always get what we deserve in this life, Jake said quietly. Sometimes we get better, sometimes worse. The trick is recognizing the difference and fighting for the better when it comes along. Rebecca turned to face him, studying his strong profile in the lamplight. What happens if Carl wins? If his hired killers are faster or luckier than you? Then I'll die knowing I stood for something that mattered. Jake replied without hesitation. That's more than most men can say. The simple honesty of his answer brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. This giant man was prepared to sacrifice everything for her and Tommy, not because duty demanded it, but because love compelled it. The realization that she had found not just protection, but genuine partnership was overwhelming. Jake, she said, softly, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. If we survive this, if we somehow come through the other side, I want you to know that my answer is yes. Yes to what? Yes to marriage. Yes to partnership. Yes to building a life together. Rebecca's voice was steady despite her tears. Not because I'm desperate anymore, but because I love you. Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He cupped her face in his massive hands, his touch infinitely gentle. Rebecca Morrison, he said, testing the sound of her new name. I like that. Before she could respond, Ranger's sharp bark shattered the peaceful moment. Through the window, they could see flickering lights moving across the distant ridge. Torches or lanterns, too many to count, approaching the ranch like fallen stars. Carl Brennan was coming, and he was bringing an army. Jake's expression hardened into something fierce and determined. Get Tommy and move to the back bedroom. Stay away from the windows and don't come out until I call for you. What about you? I'm going to remind Carl Brennan why people call this the Morrison Ranch. Jake checked his pistol and rifle, his movements efficient and deadly. And Rebecca, no matter what happens tonight, remember that I love you. As Rebecca hurried to gather Tommy, her heart pounding with fear and love in equal measure, she could hear Jake moving through the house with purposeful intent. Outside, the lights grew closer, and the sound of approaching horses carried clearly through the crisp night air. The battle for their future was about to begin. The torches moved down the hillside like a river of fire, casting dancing shadows across the snow-covered ground. From her position in the back bedroom, Rebecca counted at least 12 separate lights, which meant Carl had brought even more men than she'd feared. Tommy pressed close against her side, his small body trembling despite her attempts to comfort him. Mama, why are the bad men coming to hurt us? Tommy whispered, his 6-year-old mind struggling to understand the adult violence approaching their sanctuary. Because some people take what they want instead of earning it, Rebecca replied softly, smoothing his dark hair. But Jake won't let them hurt us, he promised. Through the floorboards, she could hear Jake moving through the house with methodical precision. Cabinet doors opened and closed as he gathered additional ammunition. His boots made steady, purposeful sounds across the wooden floors, each step radiating calm determination rather than panic. The approaching riders drew close enough for their voices to carry across the night air. Carl's distinctive laugh echoed off the barn walls, filled with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. Rebecca strained to hear individual words, but the distance and wind made conversation indistinct. Suddenly, the house fell silent. Jake had stopped moving, which meant the confrontation was about to begin. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for the first exchange of words that would determine whether this ended in negotiation or bloodshed. "Morrison." Carl's voice rang out clearly, amplified by the cold air and his own theatrical nature. "Beautiful night for a conversation, don't you think? Clear sky, bright stars, perfect visibility for everyone involved." Jake's response came from somewhere near the front door, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard. "Brennan, you're late. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about collecting this supposed debt." "Oh, I never change my mind about family obligations," Carl replied cheerfully, "though I have brought some friends to help ensure the conversation remains civilized. You remember Tex Martinez from our last visit. The other gentlemen are associates of his, equally committed to peaceful resolution." Rebecca closed her eyes, recognizing the verbal fencing that preceded violence. Carl was establishing witnesses to his supposed reasonableness, creating a narrative where Jake would appear to be the aggressor regardless of who fired the first shot. "Peaceful resolution," Jake repeated, his tone suggesting he found the phrase amusing. "Is that what you call riding onto private property with armed men in the middle of the night?" "Merely a precaution, Morrison. Your reputation for stubbornness precedes you. My associates ensure that everyone remains focused on the real issue here." Carl's voice moved slightly, indicating he was repositioning his men while talking. "And what issue would that be?" "Family loyalty, of course. Blood obligations that transcend personal convenience. My brother's widow and her boy belong with family, not with strangers who might take advantage of their vulnerable position." The accusation was carefully crafted to sound noble while implying Jake's improper intentions toward Rebecca. Carl was building justification for whatever violence he had planned, creating a story where he appeared as the righteous protector rather than the predatory aggressor. "Mrs. Thompson made her choice freely," Jake replied. "She and her son are welcome here as long as they choose to stay." "Choice." Carl's laugh was harsh and mocking. "That's a fine word for a woman with no money, no family, and no options. You took advantage of her desperation, Morrison, and dressed it up as charity." Rebecca felt anger flare in her chest at Carl's manipulation of the truth. Jake had offered genuine protection and partnership, not exploitation. But she recognized Carl's strategy. He was trying to provoke Jake into emotional response that would create an opening for his gunfighters. "Your concern for family welfare is touching, Brennan," Jake said dryly, "especially considering your own treatment of the woman you claim to want to protect." "My treatment?" Carl's voice sharpened with genuine anger. "I offered Rebecca a legitimate solution to her problems. Marriage, security, a father for her boy. She rejected my generosity out of misplaced pride." "Your generosity," Jake repeated. "Is that what you call manufactured debt and threats of legal action?" Interesting interpretation. The exchange was escalating, verbal sparring giving way to open accusations. Rebecca could hear the tension building in both men's voices, the careful politeness wearing thin under pressure of genuine hostility. "Manufactured debt." Carl's voice rose with theatrical indignation. "Are you calling me a liar, Morrison?" "I'm calling you exactly what you are, Brennan. A man who preys on widows and children, who uses intimidation and false claims to take what honest work won't earn him." The insult hung in the night air like gunpowder smoke. Rebecca held her breath, knowing that Carl would have to respond to such a direct challenge to his character. Men like Carl couldn't allow public humiliation to pass unanswered. "Those are fighting words, Morrison," Carl said, his voice now cold and deadly. "Strong accusations from a man whose own claim to this land came from a poker table. My title is legal and clear. Can you say the same about your supposed debt? Documentation can be produced when necessary." The question is whether you'll live long enough to see it. The threat was finally out in the open. Carl had abandoned any pretense of legal resolution and moved to direct intimidation. Rebecca knew that Jake would never back down from such a challenge. Not when Tommy's safety and her own honor were at stake. Is that how you want to play this, Brennan? Jake's voice carried the calm confidence of a man who had faced death before and survived. 12 men against one seems like poor odds for someone so confident in his righteous cause.
11 men, actually. Came an unexpected voice from the darkness beyond the torches. Sheriff Phillips here, Brennan, and I'm afraid I can't let this conversation continue without proper legal documentation. Rebecca's heart leaped with hope. Sheriff Dan Phillips had received Jake's message and arrived with lawful authority to intervene. But her relief was short-lived as Carl's laughter echoed across the yard. Sheriff Phillips, how convenient. Though I'm afraid you're somewhat outnumbered for effective law enforcement. Carl's confidence suggested he wasn't concerned about the sheriff's presence. Maybe, Phillips replied calmly. But I brought some assistance. Judge Carter from Cheyenne wanted to examine your supposed debt documents personally. Funny thing about territorial judges, Brennan, they take a dim view of manufactured evidence. A new voice joined the conversation, carrying the authority of high office. Mr. Brennan, I'm Judge William Carter. I'm here to examine the legal basis for your claims against Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Morrison. Rebecca felt a surge of hope. Judge Carter's reputation for honesty was well known throughout the territory. If he was here to examine Carl's supposed evidence, the truth would finally come to light. Your Honor, Carl's voice carried forced courtesy. I'm afraid this is hardly the time or place for legal proceedings. Perhaps we could schedule a more appropriate venue. On the contrary, Judge Carter replied firmly. When armed men gather on private property making threats, immediate legal review becomes necessary. Please present your documentation of Mrs. Thompson's supposed debt. The silence that followed was telling. Rebecca could imagine Carl's mind racing, trying to find a way out of the trap that was closing around him. He had never expected to face real legal scrutiny, counting on intimidation and corruption to achieve his goals. The documentation is not immediately available, Carl said finally. Stored safely in Cheyenne for protection. How convenient, Judge Carter observed. Dryly. Mr. Brennan, threatening citizens with armed force based on non-existent documentation is a serious crime in this territory. Now see here, Judge. Carl's voice took on a dangerous edge. These are family matters that don't concern territorial courts. Any matter involving threats of violence concerns my court, Mr. Brennan. I'm ordering you and your associates to disperse immediately. Rebecca heard the sound of horses moving, men repositioning themselves in response to the changing situation. But instead of withdrawing, Carl's men seemed to be surrounding the judge and sheriff. Her hope began to turn to dread as she realized Carl was too committed to back down, even from legal authority. I'm afraid I can't do that, Your Honor, Carl said, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. This matter will be resolved tonight, one way or another. Brennan, Sheriff Phillips warned. You're threatening a territorial judge. That's a hanging offense. Only if there are witnesses left to testify, came the cold reply. The statement sent ice through Rebecca's veins. Carl was prepared to murder a judge and sheriff to get what he wanted. The man's desperation or ambition had driven him completely beyond the boundaries of law and reason. You've just confessed to conspiracy and threat of murder in front of multiple witnesses, Judge Carter said with remarkable calm. Mr. Morrison, you and Sheriff Phillips are authorized to use any necessary force to apprehend these criminals. About time, Jake's voice carried grim satisfaction. I was getting tired of listening to Brennan's speeches. What happened next erupted with shocking suddenness. The first gunshot cracked across the night like breaking thunder, followed immediately by others as both sides opened fire. Rebecca pressed Tommy's face against her shoulder, trying to shield him from the terrifying sounds of combat. Through the walls of the house, she could hear Jake moving with deadly purpose. His rifle spoke repeatedly, the deep boom of his weapon distinguishable from the higher-pitched reports of pistols. Glass shattered somewhere in the front of the house as bullets found windows despite the shutters. Stay down. Jake's voice roared over the gunfire. Don't show yourself at any windows. The battle raged with savage intensity, but Rebecca gradually realized that Jake's tactical preparation was paying dividends. His fortified position gave him significant advantages over men fighting in the open. The sounds of gunfire began to shift as Carl's forces found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from the house. "Brennan," Tex Martinez's voice carried, clearly through a brief lull in the shooting. "This ain't working. Morrison's got too good a position." "Then burn him out," Carl screamed back, his voice cracking with frustrated rage. "Fire the barn. Fire everything." Horror washed over Rebecca as she realized Carl's new strategy. If he couldn't dig Jake out through gunfire, he would try to smoke them out with flames. In the dry Wyoming air, fire would spread quickly through the wooden buildings. The smell of smoke began drifting through the house within minutes. Orange light flickered beyond the windows as Carl's men torched the barn and outbuildings. Jake's careful preparations were being turned against him as the very buildings that provided shelter became potential traps. "Rebecca," Jake's voice called from somewhere in the house. "We need to move. Bring Tommy and get ready to run." She gathered her son quickly, wrapping him in a thick blanket against the cold night air. The smoke was getting thicker, seeping through the walls and making breathing difficult. Outside, the sounds of gunfire continued sporadically as Jake and his allies tried to hold their position against overwhelming odds. Jake appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face streaked with soot and his clothes torn by flying splinters. "The back of the house is still clear," he said urgently. "We're going to make for the creek bed. Sheriff Phillips is covering our retreat." "What about Judge Carter?" Rebecca asked as they hurried through the smoke-filled hallway. "Safe for now. He and Phillips are keeping Carl's men busy while we get you and Tommy to safety." They reached the back door as the sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the snow outside. Jake motioned for silence, his rifle ready as he peered through. A crack in the shutters. "Two men circling the house," he whispered. "They're trying to cut off our escape route." Before Rebecca could respond, Jake was moving. He threw open the back door and stepped into the night, his rifle speaking twice in rapid succession. Both approaching gunmen dropped to the snow, their weapons falling silent. "Now," Jake commanded. "Stay close and keep low." They ran through the swirling snow toward the creek bed, Tommy clutched tightly in Rebecca's arms. Behind them, the ranch house was beginning to catch fire, orange flames licking at the wooden walls where embers from the barn had landed. The creek bed provided temporary shelter, its banks offering protection from gunfire. But Rebecca knew they couldn't stay here long. The cold would be deadly for Tommy, and Carl's men would eventually search every hiding place. "What now?" she asked, trying to keep her teeth from chattering. "Now we turn the tables," Jake replied grimly. "Carl thinks he's won because he burned my buildings. Time to show him that buildings can be replaced, but justice can't be avoided." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night. But these weren't more of Carl's reinforcements. Rebecca recognized Pete Wilson's voice calling out Jake's name, followed by the voices of other Morrison Ranch hands. "Boss, we heard the shooting and saw the fires. What's the situation?" Jake's relief was audible as he answered. "Pete, how many men did you bring?" "8 of us, plus some neighbors who came running when they saw the smoke. Tom Bradley brought 4 men from his spread, and the Miller brothers are here with their crew." Rebecca felt hope surge through her chest. The local ranchers had come to Jake's aid, recognizing that Carl's lawlessness threatened the entire community. What had started as unequal odds was rapidly shifting in their favor. "Where's Brennan now?" Pete asked. "Last I saw, he was directing the fire setting from near the front gate. But his men are scattered around the property. Some are probably wounded or dead." "Not anymore," came a new voice from the darkness. Sheriff Phillips emerged from the shadows, supporting a limping Judge Carter. Brennan tried to make a run for it when he realized the odds had changed. Martinez and 2 others rode out with him, heading north toward Devil's Canyon. The stolen cattle, Jake realized immediately. He's falling back to his prepared position. Judge Carter, despite his injury and obvious exhaustion, spoke with clear authority. "Mr. Morrison, as a territorial judge, I'm authorizing you to form a posse and pursue these criminals. What we witnessed tonight constitutes attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy against territorial officers." Jake looked at Rebecca and Tommy, torn between his desire to end the threat permanently and his need to ensure their immediate safety. She could see the conflict in his green eyes, the weight of choosing between duty and protection. Go, Rebecca said quietly. End this once and for all. Tommy and I will be safe with Sheriff Phillips and the judge. Rebecca, I can't leave. You again. Not after what just happened. You have to, she replied firmly. Carl will never stop unless he's captured or killed. As long as he's free, none of us will ever be safe. Jake studied her face in the flickering light from the burning buildings. What he saw there seemed to convince him. Rebecca was no longer the desperate woman who had begged for his protection. She had become a partner who understood that some fights couldn't be avoided. Pete, take half the men and escort Mrs. Thompson, Tommy, Judge Carter, and Sheriff Phillips to town. The rest of us will pursue Brennan. Jake's orders were crisp and military. If we're not back by dawn, send word to the territorial marshal. As the posse formed and mounted fresh horses, Rebecca felt the weight of another separation. But this time was different. Jake wasn't leaving out of obligation or duty. He was finishing what Carl had started, ensuring that their future together would be free from the shadow of her past. Jake, she called as he prepared to mount his horse. Come back to me. We have a wedding to plan. His smile was fierce and confident. Nothing in this world could keep me away from that, Rebecca Morrison. The pursuit that followed became the stuff of local legend. Carl and his remaining men had indeed fallen back to Devil's Canyon, where they held Jake's stolen cattle as bargaining chips. But Carl had underestimated both Jake's determination and the unity of the local ranching community. The gun battle in Devil's Canyon was brief but decisive. Tex Martinez, facing overwhelming odds and realizing Carl couldn't pay wages to dead men, surrendered rather than fight to the death for a lost cause. Carl himself, cornered and desperate, tried one final gambit. Morrison, he called from behind the rocks where he'd taken shelter. Let's settle this like gentlemen. One-on-one. Winner takes all. Jake's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Brennan, you lost any claim to being a gentleman when you burned down my house and threatened a territorial judge. Come out with your hands up, or we'll come in and get you. The final shots of the conflict came minutes later as Carl chose suicide by gunfight rather than surrender. When the smoke cleared, Jake Morrison stood victorious in the canyon that had nearly become his tomb. 3 weeks later, the new Morrison Ranch house rose from the ashes of the old one. Built with help from every rancher in the territory, it stood larger and more beautiful than its predecessor. The wedding of Jake Morrison and Rebecca Thompson was held in the main room, with Judge Carter himself performing the ceremony. Tommy, dressed in his finest clothes and beaming with pride, served as ring bearer. When Judge Carter asked if anyone objected to the union, the boy spoke up clearly. Nobody better object, or they'll have to answer to my new papa. The laughter that filled the house was warm and genuine, celebrating not just a marriage but the triumph of love over adversity, of community over corruption, of hope over desperation. As spring arrived in Copper Creek, Rebecca Morrison found herself standing on the porch of her new home, watching her husband work with horses in the corral below. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, where Jake's child grew strong and healthy. Tommy raced across the yard with Ranger at his side, the boy and dog inseparable companions in their adventures around the ranch. The sight filled Rebecca's heart with contentment beyond anything she had dared dream during those desperate days when she'd first knocked on Jake Morrison's door. Any regrets? Jake asked, joining her on the porch after finishing his work. Rebecca leaned into his massive frame, finding perfect peace in his strength and warmth. Only that I waited so long to find you. Good thing you finally worked up the courage to make that crazy proposal, Jake said, his arms encircling her with gentle possessiveness. The best decision I ever made, Rebecca agreed. Though I think your counterproposal worked out even better. As the sun set over the Morrison Ranch, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them together. What had started as a desperate bargain between strangers had become the foundation for a love that would endure for generations. Their children would grow up hearing the story of how their parents met during a snowstorm, how their father had promised protection and their mother had offered everything in return. They would learn that love wasn't always convenient or easy, but that it was always worth fighting for. The Morrison Ranch prospered under their joint leadership, becoming known throughout the territory for fair dealing and honest work. Jake's Strength and Rebecca's wisdom created a partnership that extended far beyond their marriage, influencing the entire community toward justice and mutual support. Tommy grew into a fine young man who inherited his stepfather's integrity and his mother's determination. The ranch hands who worked for the Morrisons often remarked that they'd never seen a happier family or a more successful operation. But perhaps the most important legacy of that desperate night, when Rebecca Thompson had knocked on Jake Morrison's door, was the proof it provided that love could indeed conquer all obstacles. That genuine partnership between equals could overcome any adversity. That sometimes the most impossible proposals led to the most beautiful endings. The giant cowboy had kept his promise. The desperate mother had found her salvation. And together, they had built something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes, a testament to the power of love, courage, and unwavering commitment to protecting what mattered most. 23 years had passed since that desperate winter night when Rebecca Thompson first knocked on Jake Morrison's door with her impossible proposition. The Wyoming Territory had become a state, the railroad had reached Copper Creek, and the Morrison Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the American West. But on this crisp autumn morning, Rebecca Morrison found herself standing in almost the same spot where her journey had begun, watching a familiar scene unfold in the ranch yard below. A young woman with auburn hair and determined blue eyes was dismounting from a travel-worn horse, a small child clutching her skirts as she approached the main house. The woman's dress was patched and faded, her boots worn thin from hard travel, and her face carried the unmistakable expression of someone who had exhausted all other options before arriving at this door. Rebecca smiled softly, recognizing the desperation in the stranger's posture because she had worn it herself so many years ago. Time had a way of completing circles, bringing new souls to the same crossroads where others had once stood trembling between hope and despair. Jake, Rebecca called to her husband, who was working with a magnificent chestnut stallion in the main corral. At 58, Jake Morrison remained an imposing figure, his hair now silver white, but his frame still powerful and commanding. The years had seasoned him like fine leather, adding character without diminishing strength. Jake looked toward the house and immediately understood what Rebecca was indicating. He handed the stallion's lead rope to one of the ranch hands and walked with unhurried dignity toward the approaching visitor, his movements still carrying the calm authority that had impressed Rebecca all those years ago. Their eldest son, Thomas Morrison, emerged from the barn at that moment. At 22, he had inherited his father's impressive height and his mother's quick intelligence. He paused to assess the situation, recognizing like his parents that they were witnessing someone's moment of ultimate decision. Tommy Thompson Morrison, as he was known to distinguish him from his younger half-brother, had grown into a fine man who managed the ranch's horse breeding operation. Now 29 and married to the schoolteacher from town, he lived with his own family in a house built near the creek where Rebecca and Jake had once hidden from Carl Brennan's violence. "Looks like someone needs help," Thomas observed quietly, joining his mother on the porch. "Everyone needs help at some point," Rebecca replied, remembering the wisdom that had sustained her through her own dark times. "The question is whether they're brave enough to ask for it." The young woman had reached the main house now, her child pressed close against her side. Rebecca could see the internal struggle playing out across the stranger's face, the battle between pride and necessity that she remembered so well. The woman raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, clearly rehearsing words that seemed impossible to speak aloud. Jake reached the porch steps just as the woman finally found the courage to knock. His presence filled the doorway when he opened it, just as imposing now as he had been decades earlier. But Rebecca could see the gentleness in his green eyes, the immediate understanding that came from his own experience with desperate souls seeking sanctuary. "Ma'am," Jake said in his deep, rumbling voice, "you look like you've traveled a long way. Why don't you come in out of the cold?" The woman's composure cracked slightly at his kindness. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Sarah Catherine Hayes. I've come to ask something that might sound impossible, but I have nowhere else to turn." Rebecca felt her breath catch at the familiar words, though this young woman's story would undoubtedly be different from her own. Behind Jake, she could see their younger children gathering in the hallway, curious about the unexpected visitor. Mary Elizabeth, now 16 and as beautiful as her mother had been at that age, stood beside 12-year-old Jake Jr., both of them instinctively understanding that something significant was happening. "Please, come inside where it's warm," Jake said, stepping back to allow the woman and child to enter. "Mrs. Morrison will pour you some coffee while you tell us what's brought you to our door." As Sarah Hayes followed Jake into the kitchen, Rebecca noticed the way the woman's eyes took in the comfortable surroundings, the obvious prosperity and warmth that filled every corner of the Morrison home. It was the same hungry assessment Rebecca remembered making all those years ago, cataloging signs of security and permanence that seemed impossibly distant from her own circumstances. Little Mary Morrison, Sarah's daughter, clung to her mother's worn skirts with the wide-eyed wonder of a 4-year-old encountering luxury she'd never imagined. The child's thin frame and patched clothing told a story of hardship that needed no words, reminding Rebecca painfully of Tommy's appearance during their own desperate arrival. "Mrs. Hayes," Rebecca said gently, pouring steaming coffee into their finest china cups. "You mentioned having something impossible to ask. In our experience, the impossible sometimes turns out to be exactly what everyone needs." Sarah looked between Jake and Rebecca, clearly struggling with how to begin her story. "My husband died 6 months ago in a mining accident near Cheyenne. The company claimed he violated safety procedures and refused to pay any compensation. I've been trying to make ends meet, taking in washing and mending, but it's not enough. The landlord is evicting us tomorrow, and I have no family, no place to go." The story was heartbreakingly familiar, yet uniquely her own. Rebecca found herself remembering her own words from so long ago, the desperation that had driven her to make an offer that had seemed insane even to herself. "I've heard about your ranch," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed to her course. "People say you're fair employers, that you judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. They say Mrs. Morrison understands what it means to be a widow with a child." Rebecca exchanged a meaningful glance with Jake, seeing her own story reflected in Sarah's desperate courage. But she remained silent, allowing the young woman to find her own words for whatever proposition she was building toward. "I can work harder than any man you've employed," Sarah said with sudden fierce intensity. "I can cook for a crew, manage a household, handle accounts and correspondence. I've helped run businesses before my husband's death. And in return," she swallowed hard, clearly forcing herself past the final barrier of pride. "In return, I'll be whatever you need me to be. Housekeeper, bookkeeper, even a wife if you're willing to have me." The words hung in the warm kitchen air, so similar to Rebecca's own desperate offer that she felt tears prick at her eyes. But the specifics were different, shaped by Sarah's own circumstances and capabilities. This was a business proposition, born of desperation, but also of genuine skill and determination. Jake leaned back in his chair, his massive frame making the sturdy furniture creak slightly. Rebecca could see him processing Sarah's offer, measuring it against their own needs and circumstances. The ranch had grown large enough to require professional management, and Rebecca had been hoping to find someone trustworthy to handle the increasingly complex business operations. "Mrs. Hayes," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the same careful consideration Rebecca remembered from their own first conversation. "You mentioned being willing to be a wife. Do you understand what that would mean?" Sarah's chin lifted, with determined pride. "I understand that marriage is a partnership, Mr. Morrison. I'm not offering romance or passion, but I am offering loyalty, competence, and complete commitment to whatever arrangement we agree upon." The honesty was refreshing and familiar. Rebecca found herself admiring Sarah's direct approach, her willingness to speak plainly about difficult topics. This young woman possessed the same practical courage that had brought Rebecca to this same kitchen so many years ago. "And what about your daughter?" Rebecca asked gently. "How does she fit into this arrangement you're proposing?" "Mary Elizabeth is well-behaved and intelligent. She wouldn't be a burden to your household. I would ensure she contributes to the family in whatever way is appropriate for her age." Sarah's voice softened as she spoke of her child. "She deserves a chance to grow up in a stable home with opportunities one can't provide alone." Thomas Morrison, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward at this point. "Mrs. Hayes, might I suggest a different arrangement?" All eyes turned to the tall young man who carried so much of his father's presence and his mother's thoughtfulness. Rebecca felt a surge of pride at her eldest son's intervention, recognizing that he was about to offer wisdom beyond his years. The ranch operations have grown complex enough to require a full-time business manager, Thomas continued. Mother has been handling those duties while raising 6 children and managing the household. Perhaps what we need is a practical arrangement that serves everyone's interests without requiring marriage. Sarah looked confused, clearly not understanding what alternative Thomas was suggesting. Rebecca found herself holding her breath, curious about her son's proposal. What I'm suggesting, Thomas said with a gentle smile, is that you consider becoming the ranch's business manager and administrative coordinator. It's a position that would come with a comfortable house, excellent wages, and full integration into our extended family. Your daughter would grow up with my younger siblings, receive the same education and opportunities. The offer was generous and practical, addressing Sarah's needs without the complications of marriage. But Rebecca could see uncertainty in the young woman's eyes, perhaps wondering if such an arrangement would provide the security she desperately needed. Jake spoke into the silence that followed Thomas's proposal. It's a fine idea, son, but it doesn't address Mrs. Hayes's original offer. She came here with a specific proposition, and she deserves a direct response to it. He turned his attention back to Sarah, his green eyes holding the same intensity Rebecca remembered from their own pivotal conversation. Mrs. Hayes, are you genuinely prepared to marry a man you've just met, to become stepmother to 6 children, to tie your life completely to ours based on a business arrangement? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Mr. Morrison, I've learned that love is a luxury that widows with children can't always afford. But I can offer respect, partnership, and absolute loyalty. If that's sufficient foundation for marriage, then yes, I'm prepared for whatever arrangement serves both our interests. Rebecca felt her heart clench with memory and recognition. Sarah's words echoed her own from so many years ago, carrying the same blend of desperation and dignity that had impressed Jake during their first meeting. There's another consideration, Rebecca said quietly. Thomas is 22 and unmarried. Perhaps the arrangement Mrs. Hayes is proposing might be better suited to someone of her own generation. The suggestion sent a visible shock through both Thomas and Sarah. The young man's face flushed with embarrassment, while Sarah looked genuinely startled by the possibility she hadn't considered. Mother, Thomas protested, I hardly think that's appropriate. Mrs. Hayes came here seeking help from father, not romantic entanglements with his son. But Rebecca could see something shifting in Sarah's expression, a new calculation taking place as she assessed Thomas with fresh eyes. He was handsome, intelligent, and clearly destined to inherit significant responsibility in the ranch operations. From a purely practical standpoint, marriage to the heir rather than the patriarch would offer advantages she might not have considered. Mrs. Hayes, Rebecca continued with gentle persistence, you mentioned wanting security for your daughter and yourself. Thomas will someday own half this ranch. A partnership with him might serve your long-term interests better than any other arrangement we could offer. Sarah looked between Thomas and his parents, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected development in her carefully planned proposition. I appreciate your suggestion, Mrs. Morrison, but I couldn't presume to impose romantic expectations on your son. He has every right to choose his own wife when he finds someone he truly cares for. And you have every right to be chosen for your own worth rather than accepted out of pity or charity, Thomas replied, surprising everyone with his insight. Mrs. Hayes, might I suggest we spend some time getting to know each other before making any permanent decisions? My parents' marriage began as a business arrangement, but it grew into something beautiful because they were compatible people who respected each other. Rebecca felt Jake's hand find hers under the table, their fingers intertwining with the automatic intimacy of decades together. Their son was wise beyond his years, understanding that the best partnerships grew from mutual respect and shared values rather than desperate necessity. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked, her voice careful but interested. 6 months as our business manager and administrative coordinator, Thomas replied. Living in the guest house with your daughter, full wages and benefits, complete integration into our family activities. During that time, we get to know each other as people rather than as desperate strangers. If we find ourselves compatible, we can discuss marriage. If not, you'll have 6 months' wages and excellent references to help you start fresh wherever you choose. The offer was generous, practical, and respectful. Rebecca could see Sarah weighing the proposal, recognizing its advantages while still maintaining her dignity. It was exactly the kind of arrangement Rebecca herself might have hoped for if circumstances had been slightly different during her own desperate time. And if we do find ourselves compatible? Sarah asked. What kind of marriage would you envision? Thomas considered the question seriously. A true partnership, joint ownership of whatever portion of the ranch I inherit, shared decision-making in all family matters, and genuine commitment to building something lasting together. I won't promise passion or romance, but I can promise respect, loyalty, and dedication to your happiness and your daughter's welfare. The young man's maturity impressed Rebecca deeply. He was offering everything she and Jake had discovered, together, but with the wisdom of having watched a successful partnership develop over decades. Your parents would approve of such an arrangement? Sarah asked, looking between Jake and Rebecca. Our approval isn't necessary, Jake replied with a slight smile. Thomas is a grown man capable of making his own decisions. But for what it's worth, I think you'd be lucky to have each other. Rebecca nodded her agreement. Sarah, when I first came to this ranch, I was desperate and willing to accept any arrangement that would save my son and myself. What I found was something I never expected, genuine partnership with a man who saw my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. I think you and Thomas might discover the same thing. Little Mary Hayes, who had been quietly playing with a corn-husk doll near the fire, looked up at this point and addressed Thomas directly. Are you going to be my new papa if you marry my mama? The innocent question brought smiles to every adult face in the room. Thomas knelt down to the child's level, his massive frame folding with the same gentle grace Rebecca remembered from Jake's interactions with Tommy. That would depend on whether you'd want me as your papa, Thomas replied. Seriously, being a father is a big responsibility, and I'd want to make sure I was worthy of the job. Mary considered this with 4-year-old solemnity. My real papa is in heaven with the angels now. Mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. Maybe having a new papa would make her smile more. The echo of Tommy's long-ago words was so perfect that Rebecca felt tears spill down her cheeks. History was indeed repeating itself, but with new players and slightly different circumstances. Sarah wiped at her own tears, clearly overwhelmed by her daughter's acceptance of this potential new arrangement. Thomas, I accept your offer. 6 months to see if we're compatible, and if we are, a marriage based on mutual respect and shared goals. Thomas stood and extended his hand to Sarah, just as his father had done with Rebecca so many years earlier. Then we have an agreement. You start tomorrow morning, and we'll see what develops between us. As Sarah shook Thomas's hand, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of witnessing destiny arrange itself. The desperate young woman who had arrived that morning had found not just employment and security, but the possibility of love and partnership that could last a lifetime. The months that followed were a revelation for everyone involved. Sarah proved to be extraordinarily capable, managing the ranch's increasingly complex business affairs with skill that impressed even Jake. Her organizational abilities and attention to detail transformed operations that had grown unwieldy over the years. More importantly, the relationship between Sarah and Thomas developed with natural grace. They worked together seamlessly, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Thomas's intuitive understanding of cattle and horses balanced Sarah's analytical approach to markets and finances. Little Mary Hayes blossomed in the warm atmosphere of the Morrison household, becoming a beloved sister to the younger Morrison children. Her quick intelligence and sunny disposition won hearts throughout the ranch, and she began calling Thomas Papa Thomas within her first month of residence. The wedding took place on a crisp spring morning exactly 6 months after Sarah's arrival. Judge Carter, now retired but still vigorous in his 70s, performed the ceremony in the same main room where Jake and Rebecca had been married. The gathering included every rancher in the territory, testament to the Morrison family's standing in the community. Rebecca stood beside her husband, watching their eldest son marry the woman who had arrived at their door with nothing but desperation and determination. The parallels to her own story were unmistakable, yet the details were entirely Sarah and Thomas's own. Another desperate proposition leading to lasting love, Jake murmured in her ear as they watched the young couple exchange vows. Maybe desperate propositions are just love taking the long way around, Rebecca replied softly. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they can recognize what they truly need. As the years passed, Thomas and Sarah's marriage proved as successful as Rebecca and Jake's own. They expanded the ranch operations into new territories, diversified into railroad shipping and cattle breeding, and raised 4 children together who carried forward the Morrison legacy of integrity and hard work. Sarah never forgot the desperation that had brought her to the Morrison Ranch, and she made it her mission to help other women in similar circumstances. The Morrison family became known throughout the territory for taking in desperate mothers and their children, providing opportunities for dignity and self-sufficiency rather than mere charity. On her 70th birthday, Rebecca Morrison stood on the porch of the ranch house that had been rebuilt twice more over the decades, watching her great-grandchildren play in the same yard where she had once waited in terror for Carl Brennan's violence. The circle of her life felt complete, marked by love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. Jake joined her on the porch, moving more slowly now, but still possessing the quiet strength that had attracted her so many years ago. At 75, he remained the same man who had offered protection to a desperate widow and her child, though his hair was snow white and his hands bore the marks of decades of honest labor. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing a question they had shared countless times over the years. "Only that I waited so long to get desperate enough to find you," Rebecca replied with the same answer that had become their private joke. As the sun set over the Morrison Ranch, painting the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca reflected on the strange wisdom of desperation. Sometimes the most impossible propositions led to the most beautiful outcomes. Sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what really mattered. The ranch that had begun with a desperate woman's offer to trade herself for security had become a sanctuary for dozens of families over the decades. Children who had arrived hungry and frightened had grown into confident adults who carried forward values of integrity, hard work, and compassion for others in need. The Morrison name had become synonymous throughout Wyoming with fair dealing and generous hearts. Governors and senators sought Jake's counsel on territorial matters. Railroad barons and cattle kings competed for business partnerships with the Morrison Ranch. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simple proof that love could indeed conquer all obstacles, that genuine partnership between equals could overcome any adversity, and that sometimes the most desperate circumstances created opportunities for the most extraordinary happiness. The desperate mother who had once offered herself in marriage to save her child had become the matriarch of one of the most successful ranching dynasties in the American West. The giant cowboy who had risked everything to protect strangers had built not just a business empire, but a family legacy that would endure for generations. Their story was told and retold throughout the territory, inspiring other couples to take chances on love that seemed impossible, to build partnerships on foundations of mutual respect and shared determination. The Morrison Ranch became a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose to trust each other despite desperate circumstances. As night settled over the ranch, Rebecca Morrison closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the winter storm that had driven her to Jake's door all those years ago. What had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of more happiness than she had ever dared imagine possible. The impossible proposition had become the foundation for a love story that proved some promises were indeed worth keeping, no matter what the cost. Some partnerships were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds. And sometimes, just sometimes, desperate people who chose to trust each other could build something beautiful enough to last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.